Welcome to the September 2015 Windows Server update from the Microsoft Australia OEM team. In today's recording, we'll be covering off two primary topics, which is an overview of Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center around when and where you'd be using this versus where you'd be using Windows Server Standard Edition, and the appropriate licensing and virtualization rights you need to think about with both of these editions. Then we'll move on to the downgrade rights for Windows Server. So this is one of the topics that comes up very regularly after we have conversations with people around topics such as virtualization. People start asking about, what are the downgrade rights with OEM software and how do they exercise those? So first off, let's just say that yes, with Windows Server products, you do get downgrade rights. So we will be talking about those as we go through this session. Then we'll wrap up by talking about some upcoming events and then pointing you back through to the primary resources that we have available for you from the Microsoft Australia OEM team. So first of all, let's talk about the Windows Server 2012 R2 editions. So with these editions, really the main ones we're talking about today is the Standard Edition and the Data Center Edition. For the sake of this conversation, we'll leave Foundation and Essentials out of this because they've got quite different rights and requirements versus what we're covering here. So really the big difference now, or since the Windows Server 2012 release, was that there were no more technical differences between the Data Center Edition and the Standard Edition. So features like some of the network load balancing or high availability or clustering capabilities, these were things that were also now made available as part of the Standard Edition. So in the past, it used to be a conversation around the virtualization rights, for example, but it was also a technical features conversation. So today we don't need to worry about the technical features conversation. Instead, we just focus on the differentiation being provided by the virtualization rights. So just to sort of point out some of the terminology that we'll be using during the recording today, we talk about operating system environments, or in other words, or we'll be calling them OSEs. And then we'll also be talking about virtual operating system environments, or VOSEs. So you may see that referenced several times, or I'll mention that as we go through this recording. So just bear in mind it's the virtual or the operating system environments that have been installed on that server. Now, some commonality from a licensing perspective between Windows Server Standard and Data Center Editions is that a single license covers up to 2 physical processors per server. So let's just talk about this for a second. So when we're talking about physical processors, we're talking about the actual number of CPU sockets on the motherboard that are occupied. We're not talking about the number of CPU cores per CPU or anything like that in the case of Windows Server. Instead, we are just focused on the number of sockets that are populated on the motherboard. So if you've got a dual proc motherboard with 2 CPUs in it, then you would be covered with 1 license. If you had a quad processor capable server but only had 2 CPUs in it today, then that means you'd only need the 1 license to cover the 2 CPUs, but you'd need to think about if you were going to add an additional CPU or 2 CPUs, you'd need to make sure you did buy the additional Windows Server license to cover that. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go through. Now, with both Windows Server Standard and Data Center Editions, you do need client access licenses for the users or devices that will be accessing the services that they provide. And an important note here is for customers who do have Windows Server 2012 CALs, that these do also carry forward and apply to Windows Server 2012 R2. So this brings up a related topic which I'll address again later on in the session, just to reiterate. Though if you do have Windows Server 2012 server licenses as opposed to CALs, these don't give you rights to use Windows Server 2012 R2 unless you've already done something like apply software assurance through the volume license channels. So how do you decide that you should go for Data Center Edition? Well, really, if you want something that gives you the utmost in flexibility, then Data Center is really the option that you should be looking for, because it means that you don't need to worry about how many virtual machines are running per physical server. So to call out an important thing here is if you wanted this type of flexibility, you'd be purchasing a copy of Data Center per 2 CPUs per physical server that you own. And then that means that you never really need to worry about if you're running too many VMs on one server from a licensing perspective. As opposed to with Standard Edition, that's something that you do need to keep an eye on to make sure that you're not violating the licensing requirements there. So what if a customer decides to begin with that they only need Windows Server 2012 R2 standard, they think they'll only need 2 virtual machines, but then within a short time period they realize that they've got much more capacity on the server that they could be using for other workloads. So they start asking around about the option of, can they actually start adding the rights to use more virtual machines? And what they can do here is they can start assigning, or they can start purchasing additional copies of Windows Server, and there's a variety of options available here, and your distributor and OEM will be able to assist you with this conversation. But it means that you can assign these new licenses to the same physical server, and then for each of these new licenses that you acquire, it gives you the rights to run 2 more instances of Windows Server. So just be making sure here that you are covering yourself, so that if you need 8 virtual machines, you'd need to buy 4 copies of Windows Server Standard in total, for example. As soon as you start getting into situations like that, though, the conversation really should be shifting towards a data center conversation, before the sale even occurs, to try to get the customer to understand the longer term benefits that they'll have around flexibility, and even from your perspective as their partner and reseller, the additional opportunity it provides to you to start delivering, more capable solutions for the customer's ongoing requirements. So how do you calculate the number of licenses needed for a server? Well, it's not all that difficult, but if we take a look at some of the scenarios that we've got here, well, first of all, we need to determine the number of physical processor licenses. Now, realistically speaking, most servers that are sold still fall into the 2 physical processor or less space. There are some higher end servers, so here we've got 4 processor servers and 8 processor servers listed. But realistically, for most organizations that you're working with, a 2 physical processor system is really going to be what they're going to be looking at maximum in most cases. So all you really need to do here is buy 1 license. So depending on whether you need to go for standard or data center, you just buy 1 of those. But as we take a look at a 4 processor server, what it tells us here is that we'd need to buy 2 licenses of standard or data center, and in an 8 processor environment or server, we'd need to buy 4 copies. So basically, we're just going through and effectively dividing it by 2 processors. Now, how do you determine the number of virtual instances running and what the requirements are there? Well, as we've already discussed, 1 standard edition license covers up to 2 virtual operating system environments. So you divide the number of virtual operating system environments you need by 2, and you round it up to the whole number. And with data center, as I've mentioned, this is much easier because all you really need is 1 that covers you from the number of VMs. So it actually simplifies these types of calculations. Now, in the next slide, I've just got a couple of examples here around Windows Server 2012 R2 standard. And this is just sort of supporting what we saw in the previous slide. So we can see here the number of standard edition licenses on a single server. We effectively multiply it by 2, and that gives us the number of virtual operating system environments that are supported here. So you can see that it's a linear increase from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. We are just basically adding 2 per license. So what happens if we then want to look at things such as adding a second copy of Windows Server Standard Edition to an existing server? So if we take a look at this scenario here, if you take a look, we've got 2 Windows Server Standard R2 standard licenses assigned to server A, and you can see here that we're running a mix of down level and current operating systems. So the physical operating system environment is Server 2012 R2 with Hyper-V, but then we're running the down level servers, including 2008 R2 Standard and 2008 Enterprise. If we needed to run 2008 from or Windows Server 2012, we could also go through and run that here. So we could see that all of these are running as VMs, and we've got the ability to run 4 VMs here because the standard edition licenses that we've got stacked provide us with the rights to provide the 4 virtual OSEs. Now, as we move up and take a look at this scenario, we've got 6 different VMs running, but all of a sudden you can see here that we've only got 1 copy of data center because again, this is just a dual processor server. It's not a physical, it doesn't have 4 physical or 3 or higher physical CPUs. So we can take a look at the server. We can see, the representation of 2 CPUs and the representation of a single data center license. So even though we're running 6 VMs here, that number is basically only limited by what the capacity and capabilities of the server hardware are. So if it's a server that can take, 512 gig of memory, that's a lot of VMs we could potentially run on there. Whereas if it's a server that maxes out at 16 gig of memory, it may not really be the best match for data center in that case. So let's just go through 4 different frequently asked questions before we move on to the next portion, which is the downgrade rights for Windows Server. So the first one, can I mix data center and standard licenses on the same server? No, this isn't something that you are licensed or you can license. All of the processors need to be licensed with the same version and edition. So you can run different editions or older versions as guests, as VMs, as we saw in some of those slides already, but you're not allowed to assign multiple licenses of different versions or editions. And that's really just going to cause a bit of an admin nightmare if you did try to do it. So it's just easy to stick with the one that's most appropriate. Now, we've been talking about how we can use standard or data center on servers with up to 2 physical processors. But what if it's a server that's only got 1 processor? Well, that's a huge portion of the market. So standard definitely does cover that, and data center also covers that as well. Now the next question, can I split my Windows Server 2012 R2 licenses across multiple servers? It applies equally to data center or to standard, but with data center, it's where people really start getting curious about this. But when you are licensing either standard or data center, the 2 or the unlimited VMs are licensed on a per server basis. So you couldn't take an unlicensed server and say, well, I want to assign half of my licenses over to that. So in the case of standard, thinking, well, I could have 1 VM running here and 1 VM on the other server. That's not the case. Because if you think about that with Data Center Edition, if you could run it on, if you could split it across multiple servers, you don't need, regardless of the size of your organization, you'd only need to buy 1 copy and keep splitting it out indefinitely. So in this case, the answer is definitely no. You can only assign the license to a single physical server. Another question that comes up is, can I assign a Windows Server R2 license to a virtual machine? And it's like, no, you can't assign it to the virtual machine. You have to assign it to the physical server. And in that case, each license that you assign to the physical server covers up to 2 virtual physical processors. As we mentioned, either data center or standard, they both work on the 2 physical processor allowance per license. So after you assign the licenses to the physical server, now you've got the rights to use the virtual operating system environments on that server. So let's take a look now at some of the downgrade rights features and requirements, and we'll go through quite a lengthy Q&A piece here because there are a lot of questions that do come up on a regular basis around this. So it's very important to get some of the, misconceptions or misunderstandings out of the way as we go through this, because it will make your life a lot easier as people do start looking at how they exercise their downgrade rights. So first up, if we take a look at some of the examples that we've got here around where you're starting from and where you can go to, a lot of these are fairly self-explanatory. So if we just focus on the Windows Server 2012 R2 data center and Windows Server 2012 R2 standard, so effectively the blue boxes, and then move into the orange and the lighter orange boxes, you'll see that with data center, we've got the ability to start moving to previous versions of data center and standard and enterprise. Now, what you'll also see here, and this was something that was highlighted on a previous slide, but I went through it quickly because it was being covered here instead, is if you've got Windows Server Standard now, if you're stepping back down to Windows Server 2008 R2 or earlier, you could also leverage the enterprise editions if you were previously licensed for that. So that actually gives you quite a bit more flexibility here. So for customers who previously were buying the enterprise edition just because they needed some of the advanced networking capabilities that it and data center provided, now you don't need to go through that if you are just exercising downgrade rights. Now, if we look at the final column here, the Windows Server 2003 R2, 2003, 2008, this column's text has got some very, very important information, which is going to be, critical for the rest of the conversation around this topic, which is that end users may downgrade to any other version as long as they have the appropriate media and keys. So what this is saying, and what we'll reiterate, is the customer needs to provide the media and the keys in order for them to be able to perform the downgrade, or in order for you as their partner to perform the downgrade. So let's go through this in a little bit more detail. So what's the downgrade process? So these are the steps that you need to follow. So they need to use genuine Windows media and the corresponding product key. So basically, the media and the key should come from a previously licensed product from the OEM or retail channel. Now, if a customer is licensed separately through a VL program, they may provide their VL key and media to the system builder as well, to allow them to facilitate with this downgrade process. So you follow the instructions, you enter the product key, and now if you do run into any activation issues and online activation does not occur, this is when you can call up the Microsoft activation centers, and they can go through and give you the assistance that's required. So just make sure that you've got the appropriate information, that it's an original product key, that it's an original disk, etc., so that they can verify that information and make the process as simple as possible for you. So to downgrade the Windows Server, this is what the customers must do. They need to purchase a system that's licensed with the Windows Server software. They need to accept the Microsoft license terms, and then that's where you go through the process of performing the downgrade or the down edition process. Now, by down edition, what we mean is that if it's a customer who's buying a data center, for example, they may decide that they don't just want to go to 2008. They may want to go to 2008 standard edition instead of data center. So whereas downgrade is going down, the version, and down edition is the actual edition within the same product release cycle or a different product release cycle. Now, as you can see here, there's support for doing this through OEM software, through retail or VL software. But again, remember, it's the customer who needs to provide the product key and the media. So when it comes to performing the downgrade, here are the steps that the customer must follow. So they need to use that Windows Server media and the and the product key for the version of Windows Server that is eligible. It needs to come from from a previously licensed version, and the media and the key need to match each other, otherwise they're not going to work. So if someone's found an OEM disk but they're trying to use VL product keys against it, they'll find that the key and the product and the media aren't really going to go together. But the customers are, as I mentioned, they are free to use whatever the media type and key are, as long as they do match this way. So when it comes to installing the downgrade version, you just follow the activation guide. And as I mentioned, if activation does prove problematic, you can go through the troubleshooting wizard, or again, call up the activation center. So now let's go through some of the questions that are commonly raised around this. So who can install the downgrade software? So you as the system builder or reseller can go through and do this when the customer authorizes it, or the end user can do it on their own. So what this means is that a lot of the time they want you to go through, configure the server and build the server. So as long as they give you permission to do that, you are okay to use their media and their product key to do so. So where does the system builder or the end user get the media disk to perform the downgrade? So as I mentioned, this is something that the customer needs to supply. So if the customer thinks they've got an old version, it's not really good enough. They do need to provide the previous version in order to do so. Now, what you may find is, depending on what OEMs you're working with, they may have stock of down edition kits, or that you may be able to purchase at a fee from them in order to go down that path at a lower price than buying new or outright. So again, worth checking with your distributor or your OEM to see what they do have available for you. Now, will the downgraded software require product activation, and what product key should be used? Well, the chances are it will require activation, and it needs to be the product key that it originally shipped with. So again, these are things that we've already covered, but they are questions that can get asked in several different ways. So what end user downgrade and down edition options are available for OEM customers? So in this case, with Windows Server 2012 R2, you've got the right to downgrade to Windows Server 2012, 2008 R2, 2008, and Server 2003. Obviously, now that Windows Server 2003 is not a supported product, you are in a situation there, whereas if you are having issues with that product, you cannot call Microsoft for assistance on that, unfortunately. Now, with the downgrade capabilities, just remember that downgrade capabilities don't apply across the board with all Microsoft products or licensed programs. So make sure that if you are buying a product, that it is eligible. And in the case of Windows Server products in the OEM channel, they do qualify for the downgrade rights. So how are the downgrade media and keys distributed through the direct downgrade program? So as I mentioned, this is the one where you either need to work directly with your OEM or with your distributor to provide this. Now, what's important here is that generally you'll find that there's a certain time frame for which these keys or kits may be available. So you may find now that it's incredibly difficult to get a hold of Server 2008 and Server 2008 R2 direct downgrade media kits and keys from the OEMs, because that was a program that the OEMs had to stop producing and distributing those late last year. So even though there may still be some remnants in the channel, there's no guarantee that you will be able to find those. So the onus will be on the customer to provide the keys and the media. Okay. So can a new Windows Server 2012 R2 standard customer downgrade to Windows Server 2008 R2 standard, and what about to Windows Server 2003 standard? So yes, they've got the rights to do it, but as mentioned, it's going to be difficult for the customer to obtain some of these older media types now if they don't already have the media and the product key that they've used previously. Now, can keys or media from another channel be used for downgrading OEM licenses? Yes. So as we've already mentioned, you can definitely use the product keys and media from different license types, but just remember that the key and the media need to come from the same channel for the downgrade. So, OEM key with OEM media, VL key with VL media, for example. Now, is it possible to downgrade the Windows Server 2012 Remote Desktop Services CAL? So even though the CALs do have the licensing rights, you will need to obtain the product keys to activate that on the server. So what you'll need to do is contact the Microsoft Clearinghouse, and they'll be able to go through, you give them the details that you've got, and they'll be able to issue the different keys that are required for you to allow that to occur. My customer has purchased Windows Server 2012 R2 data center from a direct OEM. So think of maybe a big multinational OEM. They want to run Server 2008 R2 standard in a VM. Do they need to purchase the Windows Server 2008 R2 standard license? Where do they obtain the media and key? So no, they don't need to purchase another license. But as I mentioned, if they don't already have a key and media, this is something that today could start getting a little bit more complicated as that channel does get exhausted from the channel. Now, the final slide on the Windows Server downgrade rights. For a customer who purchases Windows Server 2012 R2 data center, can they use the same key for both physical and virtual machines? What if the VM is being downgraded, and can any previous version media and key be used? So there's only one key that is provided with 2012 and 2012 R2 that should be used for activating both the physical and the virtual instances. And if they're being downgraded, everything that we've already covered around downgrades still applies. They need to have the original media and the original key for the version they want to downgrade to, and they'll be covered. Now, moving on to an ROK question. A customer purchased Windows Server 2012 standard ROK from a reseller and now needs to downgrade to Windows Server 2008 R2 standard. How do they obtain the downgrade media and keys? Well, this again is one of the ones that's not necessarily going to be available. They'll need to contact the OEM to see if they do still have any stock. You may be able to call the disties to see if there's any stock, but at this point in time, that's something that is going to be harder to get a hold of. And now finally, is there an upgrade path for Windows Server 2012 Standard to Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard? No, unless you had something like software assurance applied to your Windows Server 2012 Standard, you don't qualify for free upgrade to an R2 version from the initial version. So I mentioned earlier that in the case of the Windows Server CALs, you do have the rights to take your 2012 CALs and apply those to 2012 R2 servers, but that doesn't apply to the underlying server operating system itself. Okay. So with that, let's move on now to the upcoming events, and then we'll wrap up with the final slide on resources. So the upcoming events we've got from an Australian perspective, these aren't necessarily all particularly or 100% focused on OEM and system builders, but there's generally going to be enough information that may make you take a look at some of these. So first up is the big Microsoft Technical Conference of the year in Australia, which is Ignite. And this is taking place on the Gold Coast from the 17th to the 20th of November. So still got a little bit of time for that one. So that's quite a big commitment. And this is one where there is quite a large focus on, I guess, more of an enterprise take on things. There's a mix of IT pro and developer content at this event. So generally there's something for everyone, but not necessarily something that's going to be drilling down and focusing on everything that you may want to learn about SMB scenarios. Now, other things we've got coming up very shortly, we've got the 3 days Windows 10 deep dive training events. So we've got these. The first one happens in Sydney on the 23rd to the 25th of September. Then we've got 2 different events running on the same day, but in different cities. In Melbourne and Brisbane on the 28th to the 30th of September, these are also running. So trying to get them done in the first quarter of the financial year. And then the final one is actually a series of different events that are taking place over the coming months. We've got the modern business technical training for SMB resellers. So this covers more of the the small business scenarios rather than larger mid-size or enterprise customers. So there's a series of events focusing on things such as connect with customers, which is all about working with customers and customer information for analysis purposes. Safeguard your business around how do you leverage the different security technologies that Windows on the client and Windows Server have got included. Grow efficiently, which covers quite a few different technologies, including leveraging Hyper-V and where to extend into cloud-based solutions where appropriate. And then the final one that's got confirmation so far is Business Anywhere, and this is running in February. And this is about using technology such as remote desktop and other remote type capabilities, so that when you're having conversations with your customers who really want to start leveraging some of the mobility solutions that their end users are expecting to be able to use, that you can quite easily start allowing these to happen. Now, there are also going to be some one-day Windows 10 training events coming shortly. We don't have the dates for those locked in just yet. I think they're waiting to see when they can be slotted into the readiness calendar. Now, you'll notice that a few of these have got asterisks at the end of them. So all of the ones with asterisks will have members of the Australian OEM team there. So make sure you do let us know that you either see these videos or read the blog sites, etc., so that we know that there may be special things we need to cover for you during the day. Now, the final slide is the resources slide. So really just 3 things here. We've got Smart HQ, which is I guess the central repository for information for OEM and system builders and resellers. So there's opportunity for you to win prizes. There are rewards up there. So go to microsoftsmarthq.com.au. We've got the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site. So this is very heavily focused on Windows Server, and also there's now being more of a focus on the Windows 10 and more of its business related capabilities rather than the consumer side. And then finally, we've got the pre-sales information email address for Microsoft OEM server products, which is oemserverau@microsoft.com. So if you do have pre-sales requests on OEM server products, please feel free to reach out to us on that address. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for sitting through this presentation today and watching the entire recording. So please feel free to reach out to us using one of those channels that we've mentioned, so that if you do have some feedback or you've got some ideas or things that you'd like us to cover, that we can reach out and do those for you very easily. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.